In the early 60s, Rory Storm was the king of Merseybeat. He had the suits, the stage, and the adoring crowd. Behind him, faithfully keeping the beat, was his drummer, Ringo Starr. But in one of rock's cruelest reversals of fortune, the king was forgotten, while the drummer became a global icon. This is the tragic story of Rory Storm, the king who lost his crown and was eclipsed by the man he once led. To understand a character as vibrant, as theatrical, and ultimately as tragic as Rory Storm, you first have to breathe the air of the city that created him. Liverpool in the 1950s was a city of stark, dramatic contrasts, a place of deep industrial shadows and surprising flashes of defiant light. It was a tough, gritty, working-class port town, still bearing the very visible and psychological scars of the Second World War. Rationing had only just ended, and a sense of gray austerity hung in the air like the perpetual sea mist. The docks, the very lifeblood of the city, were a place of hard, back-breaking labor and deeply uncertain futures. For many young people, the prospect of a life spent in a factory or hauling cargo, just like their fathers and grandfathers, loomed large and oppressive. But Liverpool was also a city with a unique and fiercely independent soul. As one of the world's great ports, it was a gateway to the wider world, a place where new sounds, new fashions, and new ideas washed ashore with every tide. The most important of these imports came courtesy of the Cunard Yanks, the thousands of local men who worked as crewmen on the Grand Cunard Line ocean liners that sailed between Liverpool and New York. They would come home with their suitcases stuffed not just with American clothes and magazines, but with records. Records by artists whose names were barely known in the rest of Britain, bluesmen like Muddy Waters, country singers like Hank Williams, and, most importantly, the new electrifying sound of rock and roll. For a generation of kids coming of age in this drab post-war world, hearing Elvis Presley, Little Richard, or Gene Vincent for the first time was like a lightning strike. This music was an escape, a jolt of pure Technicolor energy in a monochrome world. It was loud, it was rebellious, and it was theirs. Out of this environment, a new musical craze was born, skiffle. Popularized by Lonnie Donegan's hit Rock Island Line, skiffle was a kind of folk blues hybrid that was incredibly simple to play. All you needed was a cheap acoustic guitar, a washboard for percussion, and a tea-chest bass made from a broom handle and a wooden box. Suddenly, every kid in Liverpool was in a band. It was a true do-it-yourself musical revolution, a way for working-class teenagers to create their own excitement, their own culture, their own identity. This was the world that Alan Caldwell was born into in 1938. He wasn't from the toughest part of Liverpool. He grew up in a comfortable middle-class home in Broadgreen, a leafy suburb, a world away from the inner city slums. His father, Alexander, was a window cleaner who ran his own successful business. Alan was a handsome, athletic, and supremely confident young man, but he was also afflicted with a severe stammer. This speech impediment, which would have made many people shy and withdrawn, had the opposite effect on Alan. It seemed to fuel a desperate, almost manic desire to be the center of attention, to communicate not with the perfect speech he struggled with, but through sheer, overwhelming force of personality and performance. He was a sports fanatic, an excellent athlete who excelled at running, skating, and especially swimming. For a time, it seemed like his future might lie in professional sports. He even attempted to swim the English Channel, and once famously swam the entire 12-mile length of the notoriously cold and treacherous River Mersey. But the lure of the new musical explosion was too strong to resist. He caught the skiffle bug and formed a band, the Druids. But Alan Caldwell wasn't content to just be another face in the burgeoning crowd. He wasn't interested in being an ordinary band leader. He had bigger, brighter, and far more glamorous ambitions. He decided he needed a new name, a stage name, that was as exciting and dynamic as the American rock and roll stars he idolized. He chose Rory Storm. It was a perfect name, evoking a sense of wild, untamed natural energy. And with the new name came a completely new persona. The stammering Alan Caldwell transformed into the preening, charismatic Rory Storm. He formed a new band, and after a few lineup changes, they became Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. They quickly ditched the homespun, acoustic skiffle sound and embraced full-blown, high-octane electric rock and roll. In a scene filled with bands in matching conservative suits, Rory Storm and the Hurricanes were a riot of color and showmanship. Rory was the ultimate frontman. He would come on stage in flamboyant, brightly colored suits, often in shocking pink or shimmering gold lame. He dyed his hair blonde and wore it in a magnificent, towering quiff. On stage, he was a dervish of energy, a blur of motion, who would leap from pianos, climb up the stage curtains, and do absolutely anything to grab the audience's attention. He wasn't just a singer, he was an event, and his band was tight, professional, and powerful. The lineup that would become famous featured Johnny Guitar Byrne, a stoic and reliable presence on rhythm guitar, Ty O'Brien, a gifted and flashy lead guitarist, Lou Walters, the handsome, moody bass player, and on the drums, a young man from the working-class Dingle area of Liverpool named Richard Starkey, who had also adopted a stage name, Ringo Starr. By the late 1950s and the dawn of the 1960s, the Liverpool music scene, which would soon be dubbed Merseybeat, was coalescing around a few key venues, most notably the claustrophobic, sweaty cellar of the Cavern Club, and the larger dance halls like the Iron Door Club and the Tower Ballroom in New Brighton. In this fiercely competitive environment, a clear hierarchy emerged, and at the very top of that hierarchy, the undisputed kings of the Liverpool scene were Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. They were the biggest draw, the highest paid, and the most professional act in the city. Other bands, including a rough-and-tumble group of lads in leather jackets called the Beatles, regularly opened for them. For a time, Rory Storm was the sun, and everyone else, including John Paul George and their then drummer Pete Best, were merely planets orbiting in his glorious, shimmering orbit. He was on top of the world, utterly convinced that national stardom was not just a possibility, but his absolute destiny. The dawn of the 1960s was a pivotal time for the Liverpool music scene. The city was teeming with hundreds of bands, all vying for attention, all dreaming of that elusive record deal. A local promoter and club owner named Alan Williams had a bold idea. He had made connections in Hamburg, Germany, and saw an opportunity to send some of the top Liverpool bands over to play in the city's notorious Reeperbahn district, a raucous red light area of strip clubs, bars, and all-night entertainment. It was a tough, demanding, and often dangerous gig, but it paid well and offered invaluable character-building experience. In the summer of 1960, Williams offered the Hamburg residency to several bands. The first to go were Derry and the Seniors. His second choice was a band that was steadily climbing the ranks, the Beatles. His third choice, the band he considered the biggest prize and the surest bet, was Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. The Hamburg experience was a crucible that would forge the future of rock and roll. The bands were expected to play for 8 hours a night, 7 nights a week. This grueling schedule forced them to expand their repertoire, tighten their act, and develop an incredible on-stage stamina and power. It was here, in the filth and the fury of clubs like the Indra and the Kaiserkeller, that the Beatles transformed from a decent local rock and roll band into a raw, feral powerhouse live act. Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, already the most professional band in Liverpool, took Hamburg by storm. Rory's flamboyant, high-energy stage act was perfectly suited for the wild, uninhibited atmosphere of the Hamburg clubs. He was a sensation. Stories of his onstage antics became legendary. During one performance at the Kaiserkeller, he was climbing a set of decorative pillars near the stage. He made a bet with a rival band leader for 10 marks that he could climb all the way to the top. He shimmied up, dangled precariously from a lighting gantry, and continued singing until he fell, crashing onto the stage and breaking his leg. Undeterred, he finished the set and performed for weeks afterwards with his leg in a plaster cast, a testament to his absolute dedication to the show must go on mentality. It was during this intense period in Hamburg that the members of the Hurricanes and the Beatles became close friends as well as fierce rivals. They would often play on the same bill, watch each other's sets with a critical eye, and hang out in the seedy bars after the shows, sharing stories and cheap beer. There was genuine camaraderie, but also a fierce professional competition. Ringo Starr, with his steady, reliable drumming and his easygoing, witty personality, became particularly close with the members of the Beatles. He would often sit in with them when their moody drummer, Pete Best, was unavailable or unwell. John, Paul, and George were deeply impressed. They loved Ringo's style, which was less flashy but more in sync with their own musical sensibilities. And they adored his personality. A seed had been planted. While in Hamburg, both bands were offered the chance to make their first professional recordings. A small studio owner hired them to be the backing band for a singer named Wally Ethorn, who was recording a version of George Gershwin's classic Summertime. The Beatles recorded their parts, but the session highlighted their raw, unpolished sound. Rory Storm and the Hurricanes also recorded, and their professionalism and tightness shone through. But this session also exposed Rory's greatest weakness, his limitations as a recording artist. His act was almost entirely visual and visceral. His voice, while serviceable for a live rock and roll show, lacked the unique character and emotional depth of a singer like John Lennon. In the sterile environment of the studio, stripped of his stagecraft, the magnificent Rory Storm was just the stammering Alan Caldwell. Back in Liverpool, the Hurricanes continued their reign as the undisputed top live act. They were the kings of the Cavern Club. They had their own dedicated fan club and a regular headlining slot at the Tower Ballroom, where they would draw thousands of screaming fans. Their stage show was a well-oiled machine. Each member had their own solo spot, and the highlight of the show was always Ringo's feature, which they called Star Time. Ringo would come to the front of the stage and sing a popular rock and roll number like Boys or Matchbox. He was incredibly popular, a star in his own right within the band, loved for his affable charm, but the world was changing. While Rory Storm was perfecting his live act, the Beatles, now under the sophisticated guidance of their new manager Brian Epstein, were focusing on something else entirely: original songs. The songwriting partnership of Lennon and McCartney was blossoming into something truly extraordinary. They were moving beyond just playing cover versions and were creating a sound that was completely and utterly their own. Rory Storm, on the other hand, showed little to no interest in songwriting. He was an interpreter, a performer, a showman. He believed that his stage act was enough. Legend has it that he turned down the chance to record a song that Brian Epstein had offered him, a simple mid-tempo original that he thought was too slow and downbeat. The song was called Love Me Do. The absolute definitive turning point came in August of 1962. The Beatles had secured a recording contract with EMI at Abbey Road Studios. Their producer, the legendary George Martin, was unhappy with Pete Best's drumming, finding it too rigid for their new material. John, Paul, and George saw their chance. They knew exactly who they wanted. The call was made to Ringo Starr, who was at that moment playing a summer season with the Hurricanes at a Butlins holiday camp. Ringo was faced with an agonizing decision. He was a Hurricane, loyal to Rory, who had given him his start and a steady wage. The Hurricanes were still, arguably, the bigger and more successful live band in Liverpool. Joining the Beatles felt like a professional risk, but he knew deep down that the Beatles had something special. They had the original songs, the ambition, the chemistry, and now a major record deal. He made his decision. He told Rory he was leaving. Rory Storm was devastated, but he was also a professional and a friend. He wished Ringo well, though the blow was immense. He had lost not just his drummer, but a key part of his band's identity and a close friend. The departure of Ringo Starr was the moment the crown began to irrevocably slip. The King of Liverpool had just given away his most valuable jewel to his biggest rivals. It was a generous, friendly act, but it would have catastrophic consequences for his own career. The Beatles, now with their new drummer, were about to conquer the world. Rory Storm and the Hurricanes were about to be left behind, standing in the dust. The departure of Ringo Starr in August 1962 was the single most significant event in the story of Rory Storm. It was the precise moment that history pivoted, leaving Rory on the wrong side of a cultural tidal wave. While the Beatles, now with their definitive lineup, went into Abbey Road Studios to record Love Me Do and begin their meteoric, world-changing ascent, Rory Storm was left to pick up the pieces. He quickly found a new drummer, a young man named Gibson Kemp, who was a fine musician. The Hurricanes continued to be a popular live act in Liverpool and on the ballroom circuit across the UK. On the surface, it was business as usual. But something fundamental had changed. The energy, the momentum, the magic, it had all shifted decisively towards the Beatles and the other bands who were writing their own material. As Beatlemania exploded across Britain in 1963, the entire music scene was transformed. The standard for success was no longer just about being a great live band. It was about having hit records, about appearing on television, about writing your own songs. The Liverpool sound, now officially dubbed Mersey Beat, became a national phenomenon. Record company A&R men descended on the city, signing up any band that could hold a guitar and carry a tune. Jerry and the Pacemakers, the Searchers, Billy J. Kramer and the Dakotas, Cilla Black, all of these Liverpool acts, many of whom had once been support acts for the Hurricanes, were suddenly scoring #1 hits, and almost all of them were managed by Brian Epstein. Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, the former Kings, were conspicuously painfully absent from the charts. They did eventually get a record deal with Pi Records, the same label as the Searchers. In 1963, they released their first single, a cover of the popular American song Dr. Feelgood. It was a solid professional recording, but in a world now obsessed with the fresh, optimistic sound of Lennon-McCartney, it sounded dated. It lacked the magic and originality of the songs being written by their peers. The record failed to make a dent in the charts. Their second single, released in 1964, was a cover of America from the hit musical West Side Story. It was an audacious, almost desperate choice. The recording was produced by Brian Epstein himself, a gesture of goodwill towards his old friend Rory, and a genuine attempt to get him a hit. But again, it failed to connect with the record-buying public. In an era that was now defined by the fresh, original sound of the British invasion, Rory Storm was still stubbornly a performer of other people's material. He was a magnificent showman in a world that now demanded auteurs. The failure of their recording career was a source of immense frustration for the rest of the band. They knew they were a great live act, but they also saw their friends and rivals becoming international superstars. The world of private jets, television appearances, and screaming fans that their former drummer Ringo was now living in must have seemed like a distant parallel universe. Rory, however, remained outwardly optimistic, at least in public. He was a man sustained by an almost delusional level of self-belief. He was Rory Storm, the golden god, the king. In his mind, true stardom was still just around the corner. He couldn't, or perhaps wouldn't, see that the world had changed and that his particular style of entertainment was rapidly becoming obsolete. The band's career began a slow, sad decline. They were no longer the top-billed act. They found themselves playing in Butlin's holiday camps and second-tier clubs, a shadow of their former glory. One of the most poignant and rarely told stories from this period involves a tragic accident that befell the band, signaling a true end of their innocence. In 1967, their gifted lead guitarist Ty O'Brien collapsed on stage during a performance in London and died a few days later from complications of appendicitis. He was only 26 years old. This sudden, shocking tragedy devastated the band and seemed to symbolize the end of an era. The tight-knit group of friends who had set out to conquer the world together was now fractured by death and deep, abiding disappointment. Rory's personal life also began to unravel. He had invested his earnings in his father's successful window cleaning business, but he was not a wealthy man. The dream of fame and fortune had completely evaporated. He continued to live at home with his mother in the family house in Broad Green, which he had proudly renamed Stormsville. The man who had once been the undisputed king of the city's nightlife was now a local celebrity whose star had faded, a familiar, slightly tragic face in the pubs, always ready with a story about the old days when he was on top. His severe stammer, which had been almost unnoticeable when he was buoyed by success and confidence, returned with a vengeance. He became increasingly withdrawn and was known to suffer from bouts of deep depression. The contrast between the confident, swaggering Rory Storm on stage and the insecure, stammering Alan Caldwell offstage became more and more pronounced. By the early 1970s, the Hurricanes had unofficially, and without fanfare, disbanded. Rory attempted a new career as a DJ and a football commentator for a local radio station, but his heart wasn't in it. He was a man haunted by what might have been. He remained friends with Ringo, who was always kind and generous to him, but the vast, unbridgeable gulf between their lives must have been a constant, painful reminder of his own failure. Ringo was a global superstar, a member of the most famous band in history, a household name across the world. Rory was a local hero whose time had long since passed. The final tragic chapter of his life began in 1971 when his father, Alexander, died. Rory, who had been living in London and Amsterdam, returned to Liverpool to be with his mother, Violet. The two of them, now alone, lived together in the family home, Stormsville. Rory was in a deep depression, struggling with a painful chest infection and suffering from chronic insomnia. His mother was heartbroken by the loss of her husband and deeply, desperately worried about her only son. On 28th of September 1972, Rory Storm was found dead at his home. His mother, Violet, was also found dead beside him. The exact circumstances of their deaths have been the subject of debate and speculation for decades. A final sad mystery in a life full of what-ifs. An official inquest is held. The autopsy found alcohol and sleeping pills in Rory's system, but not enough to make a firm conclusion of suicide. His mother also had pills in her system. Ultimately, the coroner returned an open conclusion to Rory's death. News of the deaths of mother and son spread quickly through Liverpool, causing not a global media storm, but a wave of shock and grief in the community that had worshipped him. For fans of the Mersey Beat generation, this was not the death of an unknown star. It was the passing of our Rory. They were the people who had packed the Cavern Club, who had danced in the Tower Ballroom to his explosive performances. Rory's death felt like the official end of an innocent era, the golden age of Liverpool before the Beatles became a global phenomenon. Fans' sadness was mixed with a sense of utter injustice. They had seen him fall from number one, had seen his friends, especially his former drummer, Ringo Starr, reach the heights of fame Rory had always aspired to. For Liverpool, it was a final farewell to their forgotten king. Rory Storm was Liverpool's undisputed king, but had become a forgotten footnote in the story of his former rivals. His kindest and most generous act, letting Ringo Starr go, was also the moment that closed the door to his own eternal fame. Ultimately, Rory Storm's story is not about failure, but about the tragic cost of standing on the threshold of history and never crossing it. He is a poignant reminder that behind every shining legend, there is always the shadow of the one left behind.